Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2021 Sebald Lecture. My name is Duncan Large, and I'm the Academic Director of the British Centre for Literary Translation, which is based at the University of East Anglia in Norwich, England. The BCLT organises this annual lecture, and it's named after W.G. Sebald, who was Professor of European Literature at the University of East Anglia and set up BCLT in 1989. Max was a German writer who opted to live in the UK and continue writing in German. His novels and essays established him as a leading writer of the 20th century before his untimely death 20 years ago this year. We're able to bring the lecture to you again this year free of charge, thanks to the sponsorship of Arts Council England through our continuing core partnership with the National Centre for Writing in Norwich. As ever, we're also hugely grateful to the British Library for their expertise and, once again, digital hospitality. Last year, we held the Sebald Lecture online for the first time, and little did we imagine that it would be necessary to do so again 12 months later. In the meantime, BCLT has had an entire year's programme online: conferences, book launch symposia, research seminars, translation workshops, translation residencies, and the BCLT International Literary Translation and Creative Writing Summer School. A year ago, we scarcely thought all of this would be possible, and we eagerly look forward to resuming our physical programme with the relaxation of COVID-related restrictions, which is starting to look more than a mirage here in the UK, at least. At the same time, we've grown to appreciate the great gains in accessibility that an online programme has been able to provide us, an audience of well over 800 pre-registered for today's event from all over the world. And we will undoubtedly be continuing with an online programme in some form next year, even if we very much hope to be back in London at the British Library Conference Centre in a year's time. For the Sebald Lecture each year, we invite a prominent cultural figure to speak about literary translation from their personal perspective. This afternoon, it's my great pleasure and honour to introduce to you this year's Sebald lecturer, Jhumpa Lahiri. Born in London, Jumpa Lahiri moved to Rhode Island as a young child with her Bengali parents. She's a graduate of Barnard College and has a PhD in Renaissance Studies from Boston University. She made an extraordinary impact on the literary scene with her debut short story collection, Interpreter of Maladies, which was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction in 2000. Since then, she's published in English a further story collection, Unaccustomed Earth, in 2008, which received the 2008 Frank O'Connor International Short Story Award, and 3 further novels. The Namesake, published 2003, with a film version directed by Mira Nair, released in 2007. The Lowland came out in 2013, won the DSC Award for South Asian Fiction, and was a finalist for both the Man Booker Prize and the National Book Award in Fiction. In 2012, Jhumpa Lahiri immersed herself in the Italian language and moved to Italy, documenting the process in her Italian language memoir, In Altre Parole, translated by Anne Goldstein as In Other Words in 2016. She's published her own translations from the Italian of 2 novels by Domenico Starnone, Ties, 2017, and Trick, 2018. The latter translation awarded the 2020 John Florio Prize by the UK Society of Authors. Her Italian language novel, Dove mi trovo, 2018, has recently appeared in English self-translation as Whereabouts, from Knopf in the US and Bloomsbury in the UK. She recently edited and partly translated the Penguin Book of Italian Short Stories. Next week, she will publish her first collection of poems in Italian, Il Quaderno di Nerina. In 2015, Jhumpa Lahiri was awarded the prestigious National Humanities Medal by the NEH at the White House. Also in 2015, she joined Princeton University as Professor of Creative Writing. In 2019, she was named Director of the Creative Writing Program at Princeton. She was also named Commander of the Italian Republic by President Sergio Mattarella. All this by way of saying that Jhumpa Lahiri is one of our foremost writers who is intimately familiar with what it means to write in and move between more than one language and culture, with all aspects of translating and being translated. In other words, she's an ideal Sebald lecturer. In a moment, I'll hand over to Professor Lahiri, who will deliver her lecture from the US. After the lecture, she's kindly agreed to take questions from our live audience. We'll try to take as many questions as possible, but given the size of our audience, I hope you'll appreciate that we'll have to be very selective. If you would like to put a question to our speaker, then I invite you to use the question box below the video on your screens, which will be live throughout the lecture. For now, though, let me hand over to Jhumpa Lahiri to give the Sebald Lecture 2021 with the title In Praise of Echo.
Duncan, thank you so much for your warm words of welcome. I am really honored to be this year's Sebald Lecturer and to speak to you about translation. I'd like to thank everyone who made this possible, the BCLT and the British Library, where I've spent parts of my childhood. My father's a librarian, and he actually worked at the British Library for a time on one of his sabbatical leaves, and we lived in London, and I remember that was his office, and it was very exciting that my father's office was the British Library. In any case, I am going to speak about translation vis-a-vis Ovid and mythology, which gives my lecture its title. And I'm going to share a couple of images with you as well as I speak. So every now and then I will call for an image and tell you a little bit about why I'd like you to consider that image as I'm speaking. So I will now start the lecture itself, which is, and I'll just preface this by saying two things. One, when I quote from Ovid, I will be quoting from the Metamorphoses. I'll be citing from the translation by David Rayburn, which is a wonderful translation that I used when I wrote this essay. Since then, incredibly, I have been asked to translate Ovid with a colleague of mine in the classics department, Yelena Baraz at Princeton. So it's very interesting for me to now, this is going to be the first time I think about this piece of writing and this reflection on translation vis-a-vis Ovid, as I am myself translating this very text. So maybe that's something I can talk about a little bit more informally after this, after the talk ends. In any case, here is In Praise of Echo, thoughts on the meaning of translation. I did write this essay when I was in Rome on sabbatical, and so strangely the title was always in Italian. So I'll just share that with you as well. And that title is Elogio all'eco, una riflessione sul senso di tradurre. In February of 2016, I welcomed a group of students at Princeton University to a seminar dedicated to literary translation. I was eager to teach the course, but even more eager to learn from it myself. For it was precisely during that period that I was about to face my first formal translation project, a novel called Lacci, written by Domenico Starnone and published in 2014, which I had read in Italian and loved. The translation of Lacci was part of an ongoing phase of metamorphosis in my own life. In 2012, I moved to Rome with the objective of improving my Italian. The following year, I began writing in Italian, and this experiment led to In Altre Parole, a book composed in Italian and published in 2015. I felt bold and adventurous, but in the back of my mind, I also felt that I had skipped a crucial step on the path to acquiring and profoundly knowing a new language. When Starnone, whom I befriended in Rome, proposed that I translate Lacci, I accepted with enthusiasm, but also with apprehension. It was one thing for me to undergo a transformation from writing in English to Italian. It would be quite another to transform from a writer of my own words to a translator of someone else's words. In some sense, the thought of undergoing this second metamorphosis felt even more radical than the first. It came with a sense of responsibility that I hadn't previously had to consider. And it required not only skills, but a state of mind with which I was less familiar. So in planning the first day of my seminar at Princeton, I asked myself how to begin, how to best introduce and open up the conversation. I'd read many essays, many theories of translation in the past. And so I could have easily begun by citing essays by Benjamin or by Nabokov. Instead, I turned instinctively to Ovid's Metamorphoses, which is a work that never fails to illuminate life's mysteries to me. Let us keep in mind that Ovid's masterpiece is itself a translation, in a broad sense, of Greek mythology, born from the poet's travels, from the Roman poet's travels to Greece as a young man. And so it's his absorption of the ancient Greek language and culture that results in his Latin poem. And like almost all Latin poetry, the Metamorphoses is a work that grows out of an encounter with pre-existing literature composed in another tongue. So within this poem, I immediately thought of a specific myth, and that was the myth of Echo and Narcissus, which began to orient me, providing me with certain keys with which to begin exploring what it means to translate a text from one language to another. I began on the first day of class by saying that all translation must be regarded first and foremost as a metamorphosis, that is to say, a radical, painful, and miraculous transformation in which specific traits and elements are shed and others are newly obtained. In this sense, I told my class, nearly every episode in Ovid's great narrative poem can be read metaphorically as an example of translation, given that creatures are constantly changing states of being. That said, the myth of Echo and Narcissus is particularly resonant when considered from a translator's point of view, and it speaks to me personally, acutely, about what it means to shift from writer to translator and back again. So here we have an image from Poussin. You can see it at the Louvre. I don't know if the Louvre is open yet, and it dates from 1630, and we see the figures of Echo and Narcissus along with Eros. So it's a triangle, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what brings them to this particular situation. So let's begin with refreshing our memory of this myth, found in Book 3 of the Metamorphoses. A doomed love story. It's one of a series of tales in Ovid in which both the lover and the beloved are transformed. Echo, a mountain nymph known for her sonorous voice, is enlisted by the philandering Zeus to distract Juno by chatting with her. When Juno learns that she's been deceived by Echo's talkative nature, she condemns her to say only a portion of what other people have already said. Her capacity to speak is altered, reduced to a partial repetition of words previously generated by others. And here I'll quote Raeburn's English. But her chattering tongue could only do what it does today, that is, to parrot the last few words of the many spoken by others. That's at line 359 in Book 3. I'll give you the line numbers as I cite. Translation has always been a controversial literary form, and those who are resistant to it or dismiss it complain that the resulting transformation is a mere echo of the original, and that too much in the process of traveling from one language into another has been lost. Ovid's story draws attention to the nature of this loss or impoverishment as personified by Echo, a figure who inspires the word, also Greek in origin, to explain an acoustic phenomenon, a sound that, as a result of moving in a certain way and in encountering a barrier, returns, replicating a portion of the original sound. We must be careful, however, not to equate the word echo with simple repetition. The verb Ovid attributed to echo, once condemned, which is parrot in the English translation we're looking at, is not repetere, which is to repeat, but redere, which is principally means in Latin to give back, to return, even to restore. At first glance, it seems that Echo, who starts out as a talented storyteller, is converted, thanks to Juno's curse, into a translator. For like Echo, part of the translator's task is to listen to a text by carefully reading it, absorbing its meaning, and repeating it back. The translator reproduces words already written by duplicating them. So like Echo, the translator's arts presupposes the existence of an original text, and also presupposes that much of what makes that text beautiful and unique in the original will be impossible to maintain in another linguistic context. In Ovid's myth, Echo's condition is clearly a punishment, a deprivation of her own voice and words. But who translates ideally converts this punishment into a stimulating challenge, and often a joy. The translator repeats and thus doubles a text. And this idea of doubling, just keep that in mind as I proceed. The translator doubles a text, but this repetition must not be taken literally. Far from a restrictive act of copying, a translator restores the meaning of a text by means of an elaborate alchemical process that requires imagination, ingenuity, and freedom. And so, while the act of repeating or echoing is certainly pertinent to the subject of translation, it is only the starting point of the translator's art. Now let's proceed with our myth. Echo one day falls in love with Narcissus. And as a result, her condition, which is already compromised, turns tragic. So here we have an image of Echo. This is another French artist, Cabanel. The title of the painting is Echo, and it dates from 1874. And we see her alone and holding her hands, interestingly, to her ears, as if she doesn't want to hear, and quite distraught. So, lacking her own words, she is unable to call out to Narcissus, whom she desires. When she eventually approaches him, he repudiates her, and in a cruel comedy of errors, Narcissus, in the course of resisting her advances, falls in love with himself. Echo, in her shame, wastes away, her body vanishing to the point where she is nothing but a heap of bones and a voice. Ovid's language here is emphatic and haunting. I quote, "Nothing remained but her voice and bones, then only a voice, for her bones, so they say, were transformed to stone." The repetition of the Latin vox in the original, I'll read you the Latin as well. Vox tantum atque ossa supersunt, vox manet, ossa ferunt lapidis traxisse figuram. So the repetition of this vox in the Latin, which is voice in English, celebrates Echo's very curse, acknowledging her original talent. The word, literally echoed, elevates the insubstantial, invisible, but enduring part of her, drawing it paradoxically into sharp relief. These distressing plot points are charged with meaning, I believe, from the translator's point of view. Two details are fundamental, and they both refer to Echo. First, the act of desiring, of falling in love, which under ideal circumstances is what instigates the impulse to translate. Passion, as I said, was what moved me to translate Lacci, and everything I've translated since. I've been fortunate thus far to pick and choose my translation projects. There is no better or more satisfying way to satisfy one's love for a text than to translate it. To translate a book is to enter into a relationship with it, to approach it and accompany it, to know it intimately, word by word, and to enjoy the comfort of its company in return. One of the conditions of this relationship is the act of following, of being second, not first. So like Echo, who in Ovid, quote, stealthily followed along his tracks, a translator comes to know an author's work by literally following its tracks, by pursuing it attentively. Fittingly, we often praise a translator's efforts when we say that he or she or they have captured the spirit and sense of the original. One might say that a figurative hunt is involved, represented not only by the inevitable toil of the hunting down of the right words to recreate the text, but by a stealthy shadowing, the result of countless readings and reflections upon the work itself in order to best understand its form, its structure, and its meaning. Ironically, Echo, in one of the many surprising role reversals in this myth, is the principal hunter, while Narcissus, who is described as a hunter, is the one, for the most part, who's running away. So though Echo's hunt ends in failure, she helps us to better appreciate the translator's contradictory role as someone who comes both second and exercises a certain degree of power in the course of wrestling a text into a new language. Just going to pause for a sip. I would like to also pause for a moment on the ramifications of being first as opposed to second. Now that I've become a translator in addition to remaining a writer, I'm struck by how many people regard what I'm doing as secondary and thus creatively inferior in nature. Translation, it seems, is considered imitative as opposed to imaginative. Some people, when I tell them that I'm translating someone else's work as opposed to writing something of my own, appear almost sorry for me, as if translation projects represent a dearth of my own ideas and the solution for a fallow period, a drying up of my original voice. Readers who react with suspicion to a work in translation reinforce a perceived hierarchy in literature between an original work and its imitation. This hierarchy, sadly prevalent between what is authentic and what is derivative, one might take another step and say between what is pure and what is tainted, has distressing implications not only in terms of how we regard literature, but how we regard one another. Who is original, I ask, and who belongs authentically to a place? Who does not? Why are those who are not original to a place, migrants, for example, who did not get there, quote unquote, first, why are they treated as they are? I will turn to these implications further ahead, but for now, let's return to our myth and to translation. So the second salient point regarding Echo and her final incarnation, as it were, as nothing but a voice. So here, translators are often described as being invisible, discreet, self-sacrificing presences. Their names are frequently absent on the book covers. Their roles are meant to be supportive. Once the book has been translated, they're expected to erase themselves out of the picture and allow the book to speak for itself. Indeed, feminist scholars have argued that the practice of translation corresponds to traditional feminine archetypes in which a woman's position and identity were subservient to a man's. So Echo's wasting away, her loss of flesh, also brings to mind, for example, the penitential practices of medieval saints. In the past years, in addition to Lacci, I've translated another of Starnone's novels called Scherzetto. In fact, I've just completed a third called Confidenza in Italian, which will come out this fall under the title of Trust. And on both occasions, I wrote introductions that have expressed my admiration and critical appreciation of Starnone's works, with the exclusive aim of presenting him to a new readership. For my efforts, I was chastised by some critics more than once for interfering with the reader's relationship with the book, and for drawing attention to my own thoughts, for casting light upon my role as a translator. One reviewer, both happen to be men, pointed to my introduction as an example of, I quote, energy sapping intellectualization. And others' advice, quote, maybe next time Lahiri could just skip the introduction and let Starnone do all the talking. Like Echo before she is cursed, I was made to feel that I had been loquacious. I have no interest here in defending myself, but what I find relevant is the ongoing desire to render the translator innocuous and unobtrusive. After being rejected by Narcissus, Echo turns physically absent, quote, buried away in the forest, seen no more in the mountains. The very next line, however, reads, quote, heard all over the world, she survives in the sound of an echo. Her invisibility is countered and compensated by the presence of her voice. Again, she's a contradiction, nowhere to be seen, eternally to be heard. How should the translator, who strives to echo a work of literature on linguistic terms, according to one's vision or interpretation of it, how is the translator to strike a balance? Let's turn now to Narcissus, who shares center stage in this myth and who has spawned an adjective that has come to represent an all too common aspect of human psychology. So this is the extraordinary Narcissus, painted by Caravaggio. I've gone many times to admire it in Rome. This dates from either 1597 or possibly 1608 to 10. And here he is. As previously mentioned, Narcissus is described by Ovid as a hunter, proud and independent, conforming to conventional notions of what a writer is, a singular, inimitable voice, to be doubled and diffused perhaps by a translator's echo. If we are to draw a double analogy in which echo represents the translator and by properties of synecdoche, a work in translation, then Narcissus might personify the writer and also the original text. The circumstances of Narcissus are intriguing from the start. The seer Tiresias warns his mother, Liriope, that in order to live long, he must never know himself, quote, so long as he never knows himself. This cryptic warning, the opposite of the legendary inscription at Delphi to know oneself, the Greek gnothi seauton, disturbs and fascinates and also rings true. I speak from personal experience. It is imperative for me to know a text in order to translate it. I must know what it means and how it comes to mean what it means. As a writer, I'm far more ignorant and even unconscious of what I do. The self-involvement of writing is such that there is little room for perspective. Writing, like Narcissus's conviction that the image he sees in the pond is someone other than himself, corresponds at times to a quite infantile state in which objective reason has little or no relevance. I can try to explain what something I have written means, but in the end, I am only explaining from within myself and from my limited point of view. Narcissus is tricked by the illusion that the beautiful boy he sees reflected in the pool is someone other than himself. But in building up my analogy, I wonder if my lesson on translation is also somewhat deceiving. Echo represents certain traits of the translator. This is true. But then so does Narcissus, in that a translation is both an acoustic and visual reflection of a text, constituted, in other words, something that must be both heard and visualized by the translator, a reflection that seems to be original, while in fact being quite separate and distinct. The trick to a good translation is not to be able to recognize which is which. The minute a translation feels or sounds like a translation, the reader jumps back and accuses it and rejects it. The mighty expectation we place upon translation is that it sound true. This is why the demands upon a translation are even greater than those placed on an original text. But what makes something original as opposed to a derivation? As a writer, I can vouch for the fact that everything original I have ever written derives necessarily from something else, not just from my own experiences, but from my reading of other works, and by inspiration I have drawn, consciously and unconsciously, from countless other authors. Creativity does not exist in a vacuum, and much of it involves responding by imitating, as theorists from Plato to Auerbach to Howard Bloom have reminded us. I'm attracted to myths, incidentally, the first stories I learned to read, because they not only point back to my own origins as a reader, but because they are the only original stories that exist. stories with counterparts in all cultures that belong to everyone and to no one. When I began writing stories as a child, I wrote copies of what I read. And in many respects, that is what I have continued doing in only a slightly less obvious way. The illusion of artistic freedom is just that, an illusion. No words are my words. I merely arrange and use them in a certain way. Echo and Narcissus can be regarded as opposites and, like many opposites, as two sides of the same coin. If we attribute to Echo the act of parroting, that is to say, repeating, which comes from the Latin repetere, then Narcissus, the hunter, would be aligned with petere, meaning to strike, to seek, to assail. On the one hand, their dynamic conforms to a patriarchal model declined along conventional gender lines. The translation remains at the service of the text, whereas the text, proudly independent, resists being marred, preserved in its original state. Certainly, the text comes to occupy a privileged position, read, unaltered, over centuries, intact, in accordance with the author's intentions. While a work of art, however imperfect or incomplete, is regarded as definitive, translation is emphatically the opposite. Translation must continuously adapt to the needs of the present. It cannot divorce itself from the moment at hand, for its goal is to reach readers, to gain a contemporary audience. That is why even the greatest works of translation are always replaced by others. Translations are dispensable, but the truth is that they are also indispensable. The ongoing updated echo of translation is critical to sustaining great works of literature, to celebrating and spreading their significance across space and time. So here we have a figure that is not literally in this essay that I've written and I'm sharing with you today, reading, but is a third figure, if you will, a third and fourth figure, who figures very much in my thinking these days about translation. This is two-faced Janus, Gianno Bifronte in Italian, a Roman god, a god native to Rome. So unlike so many of the characters in Ovid, for example, Echo and Narcissus, for example, there is no Greek counterpart, right? Janus is a sort of rooted in Rome god. And here you see the phenomenon of Janus, who presided over thresholds, who looks to the past and to the future at once, who questions our very notion of the passage of time, and is a god that presides over transitions. And I ask you to consider this image as I continue to talk about Echo and Narcissus, specifically because my sense is that Echo and Narcissus are two sides of the same coin. And we often see actually images of Janus on Roman coins, incidentally. And to me, this figure, I think, is very much in conversation with Echo and Narcissus, and very much at the center of my own work now as I have moved into self-translation. But I'm going to get to that in a moment. To proceed, echoes are phenomenons, marvelous, but also unsettling, even spooky. Let's revisit the climactic scene in the myth, the moment in which Narcissus hears Echo seeking in vain to call him. Echo, deprived, as we have already established, of her own voice, wishes to address her beloved, but can only repeat what he says. Quote, "She was merely permitted and ready to wait for the sounds which her voice could return to the speaker." That's line 377. Here, the Latin expectare, which is with its combined sense of waiting and longing, merits special attention, underscoring Echo's emotional and vocal condition. And when she repeats, therefore, one there to his, is anyone there? Narcissus is startled. Hic stupet, it says in the Latin 381, line 381. As their surreal and confused conversation ensues, Narcissus seeks that voice. And for an instant, it is Narcissus who is in pursuit, and Echo who flees him. Why are you running away? He asks her at line 383. When Echo advances physically, however, Narcissus again retreats, shrinking in horror, and refuses her touch, going so far as to say that he would rather die than embrace her. So here we have Echo and Narcissus again, but this image is interesting because you can see Echo sort of with her arrows, with her bow and arrows slung across her, in a position of wanting to reach Narcissus, to find him, and he's sort of languishing by the pool, looking at himself. This is from the 19th century, where is this from? I cannot actually cite, unfortunately, the origin of this image, but it dates from the 19th century is all that I can tell you. In any case, let's consider this image as I proceed. Why is an echo, as we have already established, an act of love, of listening, and of restoring? Why is this echo so threatening? Why does that sound, which is in fact our own sound, recast by means of another, undermine and even threaten to annihilate our sense of who we are? Had the myth of Narcissus and Echo had a happy ending, their child might have grown up to become a writer-translator like me. I can trace aspects of my own creative impulse to both figures. For what is writing but a deep and direct regarding of oneself? The best of writing comes from unflinching introspection. And I see myself just as much in Echo. From my earliest memories, I've been listening to the world, trying to cast back the experience of others. I may have begun by writing my own books, but I was born with a translator's disposition, in that my overriding desire was to connect disparate worlds. I have devoted a great deal of energy in my life to absorbing the language and culture of others, the Bengali of my parents, and then later, as an adult, Italian, a language which I have now creatively adopted. When I write in Italian, one way to perceive it would be as an echo of the language itself. Let's go back to the scientific explanation. What happens when a language, in encountering a foreign body, in this case me, is cast back differently? Some Italian readers of my work define it as, quote unquote, my Italian. Correct, but anomalous, to be kept separate from a more accepted, authentic Italian, original Italian, if you will. It has even been suggested to me to be more careful and conservative with my use of the language were I to continue to write in Italian so as not to offend certain readers. Italian in its official form, whatever that may mean, should not and cannot, according to such readers, be touched or marred. In this sense, my Italian is considered an echo, in that it is considered weaker, wanting, and for some readers also distressing. But this is precisely what happens when a border is crossed. And now think back to Janice, who presides over those borders. When a new language or culture or location is experienced and absorbed. To immigrate is to observe carefully and copy certain cues. Perhaps total assimilation is not possible, nor even desirable. Each case is different. And each human being who has crossed a border, is marked by a unique set of reactions and consequences, resulting in a pattern as unique as their fingerprints. A language, and by extension a culture or nation that flees its echoes, is a culture that is turned inward, in love with itself, or with the idea of itself. Here we go back to Narcissus languishing alone. We have Eros still strangely in the background. We can almost forgive poor Narcissus, who really did believe foolishly that the figure in the water reflected back to him was someone else. But that someone was just a figment, a shadow. Those who preached to keep America great again, they still preach it, I believe, somewhere in the background, or argue for Italians first, are also in love with the shadow. The real America and also the real Italy, the two countries I've come to call home, are two extraordinary places full of diversity, cultural richness, and generous souls. And they don't correspond to the image projected in the water, to the dangerous and solipsistic nostalgia for the past. Those driven to uphold only themselves, to look inward and not outward, have only one outcome. The lines in Ovid are chilling, revealing a state in which all is contorted and convoluted. Quote, blindly wrapped with desire for himself, he was votary and idol, suitor and sweetheart, taper and fire, one at one and the same time. The Latin verbs in this passage turn reflexive. The verbs are probat, probantor, and as if eerily echoing one another. And the subject, crouched over himself, implodes and self-destructs. Blind to the truth, Narcissus succumbs to an illusion that deceives him. And Ovid makes quite explicit that his point of view is a mistake. Quote, he knows not what he is seeing. The sight still fires him with passion. His eyes are deceived, but the strange illusion excites his senses. Line 430. A culture in his position, a nation that adopts this posture, has no choice, like Narcissus himself, but to waste away. The myth of Echo and Narcissus, which I've only scratched the surface of today, helps me to reflect on the most complicated issues that I have faced thus far in my creative life, which is the act of self-translation. When my first book in Italian was facing the journey into English, I was unwilling, also emotionally incapable of undertaking that journey myself. The book was translated by another, echoed in another person's English, the aforementioned Anne Goldstein. Since then, I have translated a short story that I wrote in Italian into English. It felt odd and unnatural, but it was a matter of 10 pages and exercises that ended quickly. I tried to be faithful to the original and to reproduce a story that was very different stylistically from those I had previously written in English. Before the story was published in the New Yorker magazine, I had to insist that the phrase translated by the author appear at the end of the text. The magazine was initially averse to my request, saying this phrase would appear confusing to readers. I insisted to honor the nature of the work I had done. Now I'm going to read a paragraph. I'm just explaining that is already in the past because I've now moved ahead of this moment, but I will read it in any case and can elaborate on it. Now I face a crossroads. So again, think of Janice, and must make an important decision. How to bring Dove mi trovo, my most recent novel, conceived and written in Italian, to English readers. My reluctance to translate myself stems partly from the lesson of Narcissus. I fear that turning back to the text, looking at it for a prolonged period in a new language, but nevertheless from my point of view, would be too self-referential, amounting to a hall of mirrors, to an infinite and untenable degree. I would have to re-encounter the same story, reconfigure the same sentences already written by me. In that sense, I would also echo myself. It has been said by many that the risk for the author who self-translates is to rewrite more than translate, given that there are no rules to obey when the only authority is oneself. What is the meaning of obedience and of faithfulness when the other does not exist? So I wrote, as I said, I wrote this, I reflected on this before I translated, in other words, before I translated Dove mi trovo into Whereabouts. I can say now, having done that, that all of these considerations were, in fact, they were true in that each of these questions, yes, it is what I suspected. It was what I suspected it was. When it comes to self-translation, the hierarchy of original and derivation dissolves. To self-translate is to create two originals, twins, far from identical, separately conceived by the same person, who will eventually exist side by side. Let's conclude by returning to our myth. In the end, Echo, invisible, deprived of her body, allows Narcissus to utter his final word of adieu. It is with her voice, not his own, that he departs. Though humiliated, she is moved by his tragic end, echoing not only what he says, but what he feels. Quote, still moved with angry resentment, but moved to pity, line 494. Her behavior is indicative of another one of the translator's necessary traits, empathy. She even accompanies him into the underworld to join those grieving in his loss. Quote, and echo re-echoes their wailing. Narcissus transforms into a flower, beautiful and alive, yes, but he endures in silence, solitary, without a soul. It is Echo who looks beyond herself, who sings alongside others, who survives him, and whose voice resonates and remains. And here, if we could conclude by returning, appropriately enough, to the image of Echo. Her story and her resilience reminds us that translation, which simultaneously repeats, converts, reflects, and restores, is central to the production of literature, not an accessory to it. The richest periods of literary ferment have always been those in which identities of writers and translators merged, where one activity reinforced and revitalized the other. Classical Rome, the Renaissance, and the fervent translation activity that gained momentum in Italy in the 1930s, a period which the critic Emilio Cecchi defined as, quote, literary revolution, are just a few examples. Echo's Bones lent a title both to a short story and a poem by Samuel Beckett, a writer who, in moving out of his native English into French and then back again into English, and also converting his English works into French, experienced a metamorphosis not only in the linguistic sense, but by becoming both writer and translator. I can't help but echo Ovid again at one and the same time. The writer who never translates is at a disadvantage in that he or she will be locked, Narcissus-like, for good or for ill, in an ongoing state of self-reflection. The writer who translates, on the other hand, will both appreciate the limits of any one given language, a crucial awareness, in my opinion, and also take a great leap. The writer who translates will acquire fresh knowledge that springs from less familiar sources, nourishment which will inevitably lead to broader and more complex literary conversations. Translation will open up entire realms of possibilities, unforeseen pathways that will newly guide and inspire the writer's work, and possibly even transform it. For to translate is to look into a mirror and to see someone other than oneself. Thank you.
Thank you, Jhumpa. What a wonderful lecture. It's already been inspiring plenty of questions in the from our audience, and so I'm delighted that we have plenty of time to take questions now. And perhaps I can move. So I will be putting questions from our audience to you, and perhaps we could start off with a very general question from Ian Rushby, which is simply this: is your personality different when you speak or write in Italian rather than English? If so, which do you prefer?
I think my personality is a bit different. I think language is I think of language as a center of gravity. And so, and I mean, one generally has one. And so when I shift between languages, my center of gravity, that's a linguistic center of gravity, which is of course also connected to one's personality, one's sort of emotional temperature, if you will, one's attitude, one's perspective. I think all of these, simultaneously kind of reorganize. So I do feel different in the two languages. I feel different when I speak Bengali as well, so I'm used to that fluctuation. I'm used to that as being a very kind of just normal aspect of my life and of my being, just from my childhood, because I was raised with more than one language, and because the two languages represented such different realities, so I don't think it's the same as, for example, maybe someone who lives in a country where different languages are simultaneously sort of spoken within the the place, right? So I don't know if you take an example of a country like Holland or even parts of India, where there are many languages that are kind of just coexist on a day-to-day way. That was not my situation as a child, right? So Bengali was, seemed like in another galaxy compared to English. And all of the things that those languages represented and were connected to seemed very separate. So I was used to this sort of moving back and forth. So I do feel that when I now in Italian, Italian is has its own, because it's a language I went out of my way to learn as an adult. There's a different energy that informs my relationship to that language as well, and it feels distinct. Yeah.
Thank you. A follow-on question from Teresa Cherfas, related to the previous one, I think. Is your writing voice in Italian recognizable to a reader who's read your work in English? I suppose another way of putting that would be, are you aiming for a different voice in the two languages, and what might the implication be when you're translating between the two?
Yeah, I don't know what I'm aiming for generally, but I know what interests me. So I know that when I started writing in Italian, one of the things I identified was a new voice, a different voice, and that made me curious, right? It was like, oh, what's this? How might it be to explore thinking in this mode? Right, with this voice, and so it is distinct, it is different. As I've moved forward and now written various other things in Italian, some of my Italian readers are noting that I'm now, though I'm continuing to write in Italian, that some of the writing is beginning to circle back to the English body of work in terms of its approach, or the way I'm looking at character, the way I'm building the story. So that has been a more recent observation, that now some of the Italian responses to my most recent work in Italian, which is a book of short stories written in Italian, are saying that they're seeing more of a kind of hybrid voice in this most recent work. Whereas, for example, Dove mi trovo, which became Whereabouts, seemed more to be channeling the completely new other voice, if you will. So I think they're shades, right, of difference.
Thank you. A question from Rajiv. How simple or how difficult is it to look at your own work from an outside perspective? Do you take liberties in translating your original thoughts, a luxury which another translator would not have? And what does it tell you about translation and its possible shortcomings or value addition to the original text?
Well, this is such a deep question, ongoing question. I mean, I certainly think that, I tried to, when I translated Whereabouts, I approached it very much as a translation, and I did not want to do any kind of radical surgery and of any kind. I did, however, have to do some localized surgery to make things work in English. But then when I looked more closely at the text, even the basic sentences, what we of course know from translation is that there is no, there's no logical substitution, right, at all, and the image in the mirror is really different. It's not only backward, but it's different in all sorts of other ways, and so I think that, but I think that I do take that type of liberty already when I translate the work of other people, in that, I'm hoping to, to create the strongest possible English that is the closest possible, outcome from whatever the language in this case is Italian, doing the same thing with my translation of Ovid. I'm working with my colleague. We are working off the Latin. We are reading the Latin very carefully. She's a classicist, so she's extremely aware of every word, every line, and how the syntax is functioning. So she's checking me, right? She's saying, let's keep it closer to the Latin, which is what we're doing. But even then, the other day I translated a line and I kept it as an ablative absolute. And she herself said, "This sounds very Latin to me." I said, "Well, I thought, just keep it as a, having said this." And then we changed it. We changed it to a more relaxed English construction. But if you're interested in my sort of broader reflections on self-translation, I can point you to an essay I've written recently, which is available on the Words Without Borders website, and it's called I think it's called "Where I Find Myself" or "Translating Myself" or something along those lines. But it's out there on the web, and published, I think, in April, to coincide with the publication of my novel. And there I unpack, in some sense, that essay is the response to the piece I just shared with you. And because I wrote this essay before translating, before self-translating, and then after the act of self-translating, I then wrote that piece to kind of answer some of the questions that I threw out in this piece. So again, in a way, they both to me are kind of like a Janus, right? I mean, in some sense, I think Janus sort of is constantly entering, that his two heads are constantly entering into this conversation, because it's so much about the looking forward and the looking back, which is very much to me the act of self-translation to the highest degree, but even an act of translation of another, of a real other, like a person who isn't me with my head and my body. In that act too, there has to be that moment of turning your back on the original in order to move it forward into the other language, right? Because if you keep looking back, I do think you have to bring in another mythological figure. You have the Orpheus problem, right? Of looking back and falling back. So I think these myths are so interesting in terms of keys for me to think about the act of translation.
Thank you. You've just mentioned in your response your self-translation of Whereabouts, and a number of questions have been coming through about self-translation. I wonder if I could begin though by picking up on something you said in the lecture about when you began self-translating, and you insisted that the phrase "translated by the author" appear at the end of the text when you were publishing in the New Yorker. And I was struck by how Whereabouts doesn't have "translated by the author," or at least it's much more subtle than that. In the UK edition, at least, it is on the jacket. It explains that you've translated the book from your Italian. But I wonder, did you try to insist again on having "translated by the author" for Whereabouts, or are there differences between the US and the UK edition?
I did. I mean, let me just grab the US actually. I know that it's not on the cover, right? So here's the book in the US edition, and it just has my name on it. And you have to go to the title page to see, I don't know if you can see, but it does say, the actual.
That's very interesting. I can show you my title page of the UK edition.
Yeah, interesting.
So it's missing.
It's a very interesting omission, right? It's a very interesting omission, and I think that I think one of the things that occurs to me now that I've written, that I've created this or your version, whatever. I don't know how to define this book because, it's not this book, right? Here's the Italian, right? It's not this book, which I wrote. This is a book I wrote, nor is it, the translation of Domenico Starnone, right? Nor is it, I happen to have it here behind me. So, nor is it this book, right? This is a book by Starnone, which I've translated, right? And I have my name. They did kindly put my name here below Domenico's, which is already an incredible privilege to be placed on the cover with the author for a translator, right? So these two books make sense to me, right? These two books have a kind of logical, okay, I can trace the origin, and there's kind of a genealogy. There's a one can think about it in this way. This, I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's my book or if it's a work of translation. It is what it is. It is a work of self-translation, right? Which is its own, I do believe that it is its own, I don't want to say genre is a big word, but it's its own entity in some sense, and I think I say this from the point of view of the person who has produced this work. Do I call it another book that I wrote? Or, I can't tell, because in my mind, they're so connected, right? In my mind, it's like, they're like the Janus. They're like, the book is really, one facing this way and the other facing that way, or whatever, however you want to put it. But that's what it is to me. It's this two-headed thing now, right? And that's how I envision it. So it's very interesting to me. I don't have an answer, but I'm reflecting on what's happened now and taking some stock. I think this book exists in a kind of in-between space, right? It's a hybrid, and it's a kind of, but I don't know. Hybrids are such interesting, rich creatures coming from two. But this is kind of I don't know. It's in some sort of parenthetical space. I can't really explain. Maybe it's not my job to explain what it is anyway.
Perhaps we can take, in fact, our very first question came from Pascalis Nicolaou, who asks, do you find that the process of self-translation accelerated processes that would naturally occur at some later stage in one's writing career? Or did it foster entirely new directions and modes, including thematic ideas that would never have transpired without the linguistic switching, or perhaps both?
Well, I know that the move into Italian triggered new modes of thinking. That I know. Now it's interesting to see how that new mode of thinking and seeing sounds in English, right? In a language in which I had a very different approach originally. And now the bigger question is, do I keep writing in Italian to access that other mode that's interesting to me, and then keep moving back, sort of? So do I move into sort of a more Beckettian, place where the language has really shifted? For now, many works have been produced in Italian, right? Beyond Whereabouts, right? There are 2 other books that I've produced, and so I think I need to kind of take stock of why I wrote those books, of what compelled me to write those books in Italian, right? And maybe once I do, I'll be able to look forward again to the next project and see what makes most sense. A
question from Keris Bertram. Having produced one self-translation, would you hand over any of your future work to a translator?
I would. Yeah, I would. Because I think that, first of all, it's interesting to me to see how a translator works with my work as opposed to how I would work with my work, because all translation is interpretation. And that really interests me. It really interests me to see how people are thinking about language, so just intellectually it interests me, even if I don't, even if I would see it in a different way, it still interests me to see yet another way. I think that, I think the self-translation has completely changed the vocabulary for me in terms of a lot of things, like obviously the word original, the idea of authorship, the idea of ownership, the idea of my own words. I sort of touched on that a little bit in my talk. I think about these things very differently now. I do. But I do. And I mean, the thing about self-translation is if I keep self-translating, it means every time I produce something, I have to look back. And it was very, very intense to look back at, this is not a very long book, that I looked back at it so many times in order to be able to translate it, which is normal because that's what happens when you translate anything. But normally I enjoy that process because it's not my own work. So the torture of self-translating is that you become Narcissus in the tragic sense, is that you are just staring and staring and staring at yourself in the pool, and it is unbearable. It is a punishment, right? You just look and there's nothing else but yourself to see. And I think it contradicts, or it not contradicts is maybe the wrong word, but it's not what inspires me to translate in the first place. So what is inspiring me to translate Ovid? What has inspired me to translate Sternone? What inspires me when I think, oh, if I had all the time in the world, I'd love to translate this author or that author. That sense of that love and interest and curiosity and desire to just sort of, bask in the language of another author, and to enter into the language of another author, the world of another author. I don't get that out of self-translation at all. I don't feel that way, obviously, and thankfully, about my own work. It doesn't feed me. Self-translation is what's a bit tedious about self-translation is that it doesn't nourish me in the same way. I think what ultimately I find really nourishing is the translation of others, because it is that encounter with the other that is so rich, that is so powerful, that is so transformative. And I think, in terms of, if we think about translation as having an ethical dimension, which it does, I think with self-translation that kind of breaks down because it's so self-referential, inward. And as I said, doesn't give me that same sense of opening windows. What ended up happening when I did translate Dove mi trovo into Whereabouts was that it led me back into Dove mi trovo, because I started identifying little things in this rigorous reconsideration of the work that I wanted to adjust in the Italian. And I did. I mean, they weren't big things, but they were sort of little things. So it ended up being this sort of strange three-way, conversation between text A, the Italian, text B, which is the English, and then text B jostled text A, and it sort of became a text C, or I don't know, very, very interesting process. I think that was the biggest surprise about the translation, the self-translation process for me. I mean, that's certainly when I translate Sternone or, in translating Ovid. I mean, here's the thing, right? So like if I translate a sentence by Sternone and I adjust it to just for the sake of my English ear, it's unquestioned that that the Italian text stands, right? It stands and it will not move or shift or budge, right? But but because I'm the author of both of these works, that it was that barrier was totally porous, right? And I kept, once you go back into it, to come back out of Dove mi trovo, to move out of Dove mi trovo meant I had to open the door to that book and step into the English language, but that meant the door was suddenly open. And I could also step back into the other book, into the first book, right? And that can become very, very bewildering if you allow it to be, very destabilizing, right?
That takes us back to Janus and the god of the thresholds again. The threshold that can lead both ways. And
yeah.
You mentioned revisiting Dove mi trovo then. Did you make enough changes to bill it as a revised edition next time it comes out in Italian?
No, I mean, so it came out and then I translated it and translated whereabouts. And then I had a sort of list of little things I wanted to change. And it came out it then came out in paperback. So in my head, the paperback is a cleaner, it's like the paperback has like kind of lost those irksome last 2 kilos or whatever that that the thing needs to lose to be perfectly balanced, right? And at the ideal weight kind of thing. That's the paperback, but it's not significant enough. The changes weren't significant enough in my view, and nor in the editor's view, to say revised edition, which is in and of itself a very interesting. When we say this, when texts say, "Oh, the revised edition, the definitive edition," I mean that's the final thing that the other word that has disappeared now from my vocabulary is that word definitive. The definitive text, especially when it comes to self-translation, and even in now embarking on this gargantuan but incredible labor of love of translating the Metamorphoses. There are differing texts, right? And so because I'm working with someone who really knows, the entire literature and can say, okay, well, this is so-and-so's edition and he uses this word and we can talk about it. But even there is always ambiguity, and there are, and this gets into a much larger conversation about the preservation of texts, how these texts were, how we have received them, how they were copied down, et cetera, et cetera. It's fascinating, right? When you think about it, really fascinating to think about it across history.
I wonder if I could ask you another question about self-translation. It comes from my colleague at UEA, Eugenia Calvert. And she says, Rania Grutman has written about you as someone who refused to self-translate a few years ago. Has your position changed then in recent years? Could you perhaps say a little more about this choice, if it is indeed a choice?
Well, it's clearly changed. And that was then, and this is now, right? When I didn't self-translate, it was for a reason, right? It was because I felt that self-translation would be a kind of Orpheus-like looking back to English, a kind of dangerous slipping back into English. That's what English was at that point, right? Because in my desire to create to have a foothold and sense of rootedness in Italian, I really had to kind of avoid English as much as I could. And so to open that door, to open that sort of very bewildering, porous, area between the two texts, I think would have been deeply destabilizing for me when I had written in other words. And that was how long ago now? 7 years ago. A lot has changed since then. Right. And my Italian has changed, and my relationship to Italian has changed. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid Italian is going to go, poof, if I suddenly work in English again, because that was it's an emotional thing, right? It was driven by emotions really more than anything else. It wasn't a really rational choice to not translate in other words. It was just, no, I don't want to do that. And so I didn't, right? And I was grateful that someone else did. But then time passed. I continued writing in Italian. The experiment deepened and complicated. And by the time I translated Dove mi trovo into Whereabouts, that felt like an interesting challenge, right? So, I mean, I think I'm just moving from challenge to challenge. And what do we learn from Ovid's great poem? We learn that change is the protagonist of life, right? And everything is shifting. And so language is shifting. We are shifting. We are shifting through life. We are shifting from life to death. We are shifting on all sorts of levels. Translation can be thought of, as an act of shifting. But so I'm changing. So I mean, that was a snapshot in one moment, but it's impossible to, to stay still. I think if we are alive, we're going to grow, we're going to change.
There are some questions about other languages as well then. And one question from Ekne Bowen at Trinity College Dublin. Have you translated any literature from Bengali into English? And if yes, has this been a very different process and experience?
Yeah, it was. And I have, and it was very different. So my first formal translation project was in graduate school at Boston University. And I took a translation workshop or seminar. That was the first sort of moment where I stopped to really think about translation, what it meant. I mean, even though it was a sort of instinctive part of my life in some sense, from my entire life, acts of translating and interpreting. But that was the first time I stopped to consider it. So for my thesis, I had to produce a thesis. I translated the work of a Bengali short story writer named Ashapurna Devi. But it was a very particular, lovely process, but a sort of unconventional process, because my Bengali is, my grasp of it is as an oral language, right? It's a language I learned speaking to my parents and all of their friends, etc. My extended family in Calcutta, as a spoken language. Right. So my ability to read and write it they exist, but they're very limited. And so I really would not be, I was not in a position to comfortably translate the work of this short story writer whom my mother adored this writer, Ashapurna Devi, and she would often talk to me about her. And sometimes she would just read one of her stories out loud to me. So I was used to hearing these stories. And so when I thought about translating, I had an idea, and I asked my mother, and she was incredibly generous. And what she did was she read the stories out loud. And this was back in the 90s, and we had tape recorders and not telephones. And I put a little cassette into the tape recorder, and I just pressed the red button, and she read the story. And then I would take the tape back to my house where I was living in Boston and play them back and play them back and play them back. And that's how I produced that thesis. I translated, I don't know, maybe it was an academic, it wasn't a book length thing, but I translated maybe 5 or 6 stories and wrote an introduction to her. And so that was the first translation project. That I did.
Thinking of translating from and into other languages, a question from Ekaterina Petrova. You said that self-translation destroys the hierarchy of original and translation, and that it in fact creates 2 originals. So when your novel Whereabouts is translated into other languages, would you have a preference whether it's translated from the Italian or from the English version? How would a translation from each be different?
Fascinating. That's such an interesting question. I haven't even thought about it until now, because so the book came out in Italian, and then it was translated into Spanish and into Dutch, and I believe into German out of Italian. Maybe a few other languages, but a few, not a lot, but a couple, and those were certainly the ones. These are the ones that come to mind, and they translated off the Italian. And in fact, it was my Dutch translator who pointed out a little discrepancy in the book in Dove mi trovo, because at one point I talk about there's a scene at a dinner party, and there are actually 8 people in the room and they sit down to the table, but the narrator, because I clearly was not born to be a mathematician, I said, we are 6 at the table. And she said, actually, I think there are 8 people at the table. I said, you are right. And so then there were little post-it in the books to say to my Italian editor, when there's a reprint or whatever, please fix this issue. And so those books were translated off the Italian. Now the book has come out in English. I think I would ask, if someone wants to translate the book now, I think I would ask them to translate out of the Italian. The problem is if they can't. Do you see what I'm saying? I mean, if there's an option for a translation and there's no Italian, if there's no one who knows Italian in that language who's interested in translating it. So if there were a crossroads, like, so say the book is, I don't know, any language, Chinese, let's just say, I mean, and this is, I know there are lots of Chinese translators who can translate out of Italian, but say there isn't one who wants to do it, right? So if the choice is between no Chinese translation or a translation into Chinese out of this, I guess that would be okay, but it would be, I would want that specified maybe somehow in the text, because it is a different book. To me, it is and always will be an Italian book. So that's why I have this strange relationship to this. I don't know quite what to call it or do with it, very strange.
A question from Gabby Steinker. The Welsh poet and academic Mererid Hopwood has argued convincingly that to translate, far from being a mere substitution of words, includes reassessing the world from a different point of view. How would this relate to self-translation?
Well, it certainly meant reassessing what I had done, if that is answering the question. And absolutely, I mean, substitution is not, as I said, is not possible. I think the only place where substitution comes into play is in the end, when this book substitutes in a large, broader way this book, right? For the reader who can't read this book comes along and substitutes for that object, right? But internally, there's no, as we know, as translators, we know there's no substitution. But a reconfiguration of how things are being seen. Absolutely, yeah. I'm not sure if I'm answering the question, but I would agree.
I wonder if I could ask a question about an aspect which we haven't touched on so far, which is your teaching of translation and whether that has changed since you've been translating more yourself and self-translating.
Well, I love teaching translation, and it's what I've come to love teaching most. And in fact, what I wish I could do is just teach translation. I mean, I am a writer, and what I would like to do most is to teach translation as both training for potentially, for translators, for future translators, and also apprenticeship for potentially a writer, right? And from my work on the Penguin Book of Italian Short Stories, which is an anthology that I edited of 40 Italian short story writers of the 20th century, what the big revelation in putting that book together was just how many of them were writer translators, how many of them had this double strand to their literary productivity and identity, so whether it's someone like Cesare Pavese, right, writer translator, Primo Levi was a writer-translator. I mean, so many of them were writer-translators. And Vittorini, to whom the book is in some sense dedicated. Cristina Campo. I mean, most of these authors in that anthology were writer-translators. And so one sees how their writing emerges and is there's the cross-pollination, there's the fertilization, there's this wonderful sort of very interesting ecosystem between, that happens, that comes into play. And that excites me so much. And I try to talk about this and convey this to my students, to say that writing and translating aren't these two very different possible spheres of activity, but again, we can think of Janus, again, we can think of back to the figure of Janus and how that image represents also that idea of having the two faces and being the writer and the translator, right? In together in one body. Because I do think that translation is the best way for someone to learn how to write. Translation is now, I mean, I believe, having written for all of these years and having taught writing, having worked with students, I believe that it is translation that enables you to understand your instrument in a way that nothing else will enable you to have that kind of access to language, right? Language being an instrument, right? And that's what I think is the most interesting aspect of writing, is language. And I've always thought that. And I think people for whom writing, this is just me, right? Because there are other people who will say, well, the most interesting thing about writing is the story, or creating characters, or things like that. I have been someone who from the very beginning has been, the point of connection to me in any kind of writing is the language, is the sound, is the rhythm of the sentences. I hear things that I write. I have to hear things in order to write them. There's a lot of sort of, echo-like activity in terms of my own activity as a writer, right? I'm very attuned to that. And so that's what excites me so much about the work of translation, because then you just focus on language and how it's put together and how complex it is and how ambiguous it is, and how the extraordinary range of choices in certain moments of articulating a thought or an emotion, the possibilities of how to structure a sentence, what is syntax, what is grammar. I mean, all of these things, you're receiving them in a kind of intravenous way, if you will. And reading can't give you that, right? Mere reading without translating won't get you there. Won't get you into that. What I say to my students, it doesn't get you into the boiler room of the house. You live in the house and you enjoy it, but you don't see the mechanicals, and you don't see what is really making that hot water come out of the tap, and you don't appreciate it. You don't appreciate it as a result. But if you translate, you do. If you translate, you begin to have that kind of awareness and appreciation for everything that you read and everything that you write.
Thank you, Jhumpa. I think our time is up, I'm afraid, but thank you so much for your generous answers to so many of our audience's questions. And thank you above all for your extraordinary Sebald Lecture, a wonderful plaidoyer for us to respect more the figure of Echo, and thereby the figure of the translator as well. So just to say to our audience that I believe that the International Booker Prize presentation is going to be starting in about half an hour, and you may want to extend the literary delights of the evening. Thank you once again to the British Library for hosting us and for the technical team behind the scenes. I hope that our audience will be able to join us again for further BCLT events and activities online in the coming year. But for the moment, thank you once again, Jhumpa Lahiri, for a splendid Sebald Lecture 2021.
Thank you. It's been such an honor, and I really appreciate this invitation and was very delighted to be here. And thank you to everyone who listened and asked questions and just shared this moment to think about the wonderful, mysterious, and crucial work of translation.